Hey, Nathan here from PH Studios, and welcome back to another tower defense game tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the GameOverScreen and get that coded, and we'll continue on to the next screen. Okay, so we implemented the abstract class data in the last tutorial, which just gave us the public override methods and properties, and it gave us the throw new not implemented exception. So I added a few fields and properties here. I created a play and quit object of the main menu entry class, so you want to do that, and then I'm using fields for the properties for the action names. So I created string objects for the previous entry, next entry, selected entry, and cancel menu, and I'd simply return those in the appropriate property. Finally, I have a level select object of the level selection screen. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual coding of this class. So first things up, we're going to start with the constructor, public GameOverScreen, and it's going to accept the level selection screen. And I just called it LSS in the finished code. Now, this is going to set up all of our properties and fields and everything. So, let's set up our action names. So, the previous entry action name is going to be menu up. It's going to go up in the menu. Next entry will be the opposite, menu down. Now, why am I doing this for the action names? Well, if you have a menu system that's from left to right, you'll want to use menu left and menu right, or any other action name you choose. Selected entry is equal to menu accept. Cancel menu is equal to menu cancel. So those are the action names. Now this is a menu system, so it does support the transitions. So I'm going to transition the screen on and off. Transition on time is going to equal time span from seconds. So it's going to transition on 1 second. Transition off time is equal to time span from seconds 0.5. So it's going to take half a second to transition the screen off. In the menu screen, there's a selected color, so let's set that up. Whatever you decide you want the select color to be, and the highlighted color, I'm setting mine up as 214R, 232G, and 223B for RGB value. So the color I'm setting up is 214 in the red channel, 232 in the green channel, and 223 in the blue channel. And that's going for both the selected and highlighted colors. Normal color is going to be 104, 173, 178. And this, I just got these values from going into Photoshop and designing the user interface and how it looks. Level select is equal to LSS. So that is the constructor. Now let's look at initialize screen. Now every screen in the screen system has an input map associated with it. And that input map is automatically generated, so you don't have to do that yourself. But you do have to set up the actions. So input map dot new action. So now we set up our actions for our keyboard or mouse or whatever. previous entry action name, and we're going to set that up as the up arrow key, keys.up. And I'm going to add using Microsoft.xna.framework.input. So the previous entry name, remember that is menu up, so I'm using the up arrow key. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this below. And I'm going to set this up as next entry action name, and that's going to be keys.down. I'm going to paste it again, and I'm going to set this up as selected entry action name, and that's keys.enter. And one final paste for the final action. Menu cancel. Action name, and that's going to be keys.escape. So we set up our input system for up, down, enter, and escape. Now we need to set up our entries, our play and quit entries. So play is equal to new main menu entry. We pass it this, the title we want to use, play again, and the description, game over. Play the game again. So the menu entry accepts the menu system it belongs to, the title of the entry, and the description. I'm going to copy and paste that and set up quit in a similar way. And I'm going to change the play again to quit. And I'm going to set the description up as done playing for now. So those are our two entries. Now let's set up the events for the menu system and the entries themselves. So whenever the menu system is removing, each screen supports a removing event, and you can call that event whenever the screen is removing from the system. Whenever the screen is entering, we want to throw an event and do some logic. Whenever a screen is exiting. By the way, whenever this comes up, I press tab to insert and then tab to generate the method. So those are the menu system's event. Whenever it's being removed, whenever it's entering and exiting, it's going to go to these methods and perform some logic. Now, whenever you select a menu entry, it's going to perform logic as well. So each menu entry has a selected event. I waited too long for the auto-generate. So quit.selected plus equals. Alright, so now we have all of our events set up. Now let's add these entries to the list. And now the menu screen has a menu entries list, so we just call .add, and we add it to the list. So this menu system supports a description area. That's where it will display the description text you set up here. So what we need to do is get the viewport, and that's from the Microsoft.xna.framework.graphics. So you'll need to add the using statement there. So we get to the viewport, and now I'm just going to call it view. And we get that from the screen system.viewport. So once we get the viewport, we can set description area. That menu system has a method that you can call that will set the description area. It needs a rectangle as the first parameter, So we create a new rectangle as I already did all this in the Photoshop side, so I have all these calculations done. So 100 in the X, it's going to be 100 from the far left side of the game window. The Y is going to be view.height minus 100. It's going to be the view.height pushes it to the very bottom of the game window, and I'm going to subtract 100 pixels from that. Comma, view.width. We want it to go 100% to the game window. Minus 100, minus the 100 that we added in the X direction. Comma, 50. It's going to be 50 pixels tall. Alright, so now we have a comma, and it wants a box color. So we need to have a new color, and it's going to be 11, 38, 40. Comma, now it wants a text color. So the new color is going to be 29, 108, 117. Finally, it wants the scale. And if you look at the far left side of the little flyout, you'll see one of two. Those are overloads. So instead, I'm going to use the padding, the 2 of 2 overload. So it needs to have padding. So I'm going to set up a new point with 10, 0. I just want it to be padded on the x-axis. Now it wants the scale, and I'll do 0.5f. Closing parentheses and semicolon. Alright, so like I said before, these color variables, the RGB data for each of these colors I got from when I designed what it looks like in Photoshop. You can use these color values, or if you want to go into Photoshop or some other image manipulation program, you can find out the color values you want there. Alright, so that is it for the initialize screen method. Now let's go to the load content. So the load content is going to use the content manager, and we need to add the using Microsoft.xna.framework.content, and we get the content manager from the screen system.content. Each menu system has its own sprite font, so we need to load that. And we load it from the fonts folder, and we call it menu. Remember the folders we set up in the previous tutorial? And like the first tutorial, we set up all these folders in the content. And one of those is the fonts folder. So that's just telling us to look for the menu sprite font in the fonts folder. So now we have a texture 2D for the entry texture. And we're going to call content.load on that. It's going to be a texture 2D. And we're going to look in the textures folder, menu subfolder, menu entries as is the asset name. Ending quote, ending parentheses, and semicolon. Now that is the entry texture. The menu system is built to support a background texture, so we just need to call content.load on that property. It is a texture 2D, and we're going to load the background texture, which is in textures, menu, main menu, background. The menu system also supports the title texture, and that's by default. So we just need to call content.load on that property. Oop, not a quote. It's going to be a texture 2D object. And we're going to look in the textures folder, the menu subfolder, and it's going to be called logo with text. Okay. Now the menu system supports a initial title position where it is at the very beginning, and then we can fade it in, slide it in, whatever we want to do. This is just the basic initial position. But for our game, we're going to set the initial title position as equal to the title position. So we're going to set them both to the same value. And that is a vector2 object. And we're going to use the screen system's viewport. So set it up as a new vector2, two opening parentheses, screen system.viewport.width minus title texture dot width. We're going to set it up to half the width of the screen. So we need to close the first parentheses, divide by 2. And we're going to use integer division so we don't get floating decimals for this vector 2. And we're going to set it up as 50 pixels as the pushing it 50 pixels down. Okay, so since load content is called after initialize screen, we need to perform logic like if we want to center our text vertically because we load the textures after we initialized our entries. So if you want to do anything with the textures like centering your text vertically within those textures, you'll need to do it in the load content method itself. So for int I is equal to 0, I is less than menu entries dot count. We're going to iterate through every menu entry. So we can set up, we'll use the entries width and height. We'll make sure everything's centered and positioned vertically by using the textures. So menu entries sub I, so the ith element in the menu entry, dot add texture. In my screen system, the menu entries have an add texture method. And if you look at the overloads, we're going to use the second one. So we're going to add the entry texture to this menu entry. Number of textures in the X. So if you are designing your own menu system, let's look at the completed one here, just one. So if you're building your own menu entry and your own graphics for this game, you want to generate how the entries work in the file. Now I'm using a Sprite Sheet for that, so I load them up in two entries in one file. So I set it up to have the engine support how many in the X direction and the Y direction. So how many buttons you have in there. So that is what I'm doing here. I'm setting up to where number of buttons in the X in this texture is 2. Number in Y is 1. Alright. Now it wants a rectangle. Now this entry texture is a sprite sheet. So now it needs to have a rectangle. So what we need to do is we need to give it the rectangle of our selected entry. Where in the texture is the selected entry texture that we want to use? And that's using a rectangle. Because we have a sprite sheet, it needs to know what rectangle to use. So let's set up a new rectangle. And the way I set it up is the very first item in that sprite sheet is the selected entry. The one after that is the not selected entry. So the very first thing, 0, 0, entry texture dot width divided by 2. Remember, we only have 2 in the x, comma, entry texture dot height. So that is referring to the selected entry, our first texture in this sprite sheet. Comma. Now it wants the normal entry. And to get that, we just do the other one. So we need to set it up as new rectangle. And we're going to use entry texture dot width divided by 2. So we started where the other one ended, comma 0, comma entry texture dot width divided by 2. Remember, rectangles start with x, y, then the width, and then the height of the rectangle. The width is going to be the same as the one we did before, because that's the width of our each entry is the texture's width divided by 2. So that's why we set up the width as the same as the x. We're pushing it to start at the center of the texture, but the width is still half the texture size. Now the y is going to be the same thing, entry texture dot height, because it's the full height. Close, close, semicolon. Alright, so that's when we add a texture, it supports a sprite sheet. So now, what we need to do, menu entry sub I, we need to add some padding. And we just add padding to the menu entries. And if you've used CSS or did any web development work, add padding is kind of like the same thing. You can add it for all, and I just made a second one for just the left and the top. You can extend this if you want to, and add a left, top, right, and bottom, and let it work that way. So for now, I'm just going to pad the left as 14 and 0 as the top. Okay, so when we are iterating through the menu entries, we need to look at how to space them out. So if it's the first element, we want to do some direct positioning. We're going to set it up as the x coordinate and y coordinate for that entry. For any other entries, we're going to offset it based on the previous element's location. So if the element is the first one, we can check that by seeing if I is equal to 0. We're going to set it up based on the direct positioning. X in pixels, Y in pixels. So menu entry sub I dot set position, opening parentheses, it accepts a vector 2. It's going to be 180, comma, 250. Closing parentheses, and it is the default position. How did I get these values? Again, after my Photoshop process, I got the 180 by 250. That's what I want it to look like. Okay, so else, for any other entry that is not the first one, we need to calculate the offset. So we're going to calculate offset Y. My menu entry is from the top to bottom. You might have a menu entry that goes from left to right. In that case, you want to offset X. So we offset Y by having the menu entries I minus 1. The previous entry dot entry texture. Check if that is equal to null. If it is null, we will use the sprite font dot line spacing. If it is not null, we will set up a separation of the entries, the pixels of the image. It's going to add those, the menu system adds those. But we also want to separate those farther. So we're going to use a static value of 8. And again, Photoshop is how I determine the appropriate value for that. So now we're going to set up menu entry sub I dot set relative position. It's going to be based off the previous entry. First, it wants a vector 2, and we're going to set that up as 0, comma, offset y. The vector 2 is a offset vector based off the previous or the entry that you want to use as a relative position. So if it's 1, comma 1, it's going to be relative to the menu entry we're going to pass in here. Menu entries sub I minus 1. And it is the default position. So set relative position accepts a offset vector 2, and the menu entry we use as the where to set it up as a relative position. Okay, so public override unload content. We're going to get rid of our sprite font object. We're just going to set it to null. Okay, so now when we are entering, so let's go to the GameOverScreen entering. We want to perform some code here. So when it's entering, what we want to do is we want to have it slide in, but do it in a transitional way. We don't want it to be a static. So we want it to slide in from the left and then go into place where it's supposed to be. We also want it to fade in from 0% opacity to 100% opacity. So what we need to do here is we need to set that code up in this entering event. So we set up a float effect is equal to, we cast it as a float because we use math.power, and that returns a double as you see in the flyout menu here. So we need to cast it as a float. So we power the transition event args, I just call it TEA, dot percent. The percent it is transitioned so far, comma, we subtract 1, comma 2. Now why do we subtract 1? Because we're setting the offset based off the percent. If it's 100% completed, it's going to be the original position. If it's 0% completed, it's going to be like 100 pixels to the left. So if it's 0, we need to subtract it by 1, and we multiply that result times 100, let's say. So once we do that, right after the end parentheses, we're going to multiply this by 100. So it gives us a nice percentage value. Okay, now, for each menu entry in, or we're going to call it entry, in menu entries. So for each menu entry in entries, we're going to set up the entry.acceleration is equal to new vector 2 effect, comma 0. We're going to set up its position is equal to entry.default position plus entry.acceleration. Remember, that's why we subtract the percent minus 1, because when it's 0%, this equals 1. So now we take the power of 1 to 2, which is 1, and then we multiply that by 100. So now the effect is 100 pixels to the left. Okay, so now we got the position set up. Let's set the entry.scale. We also want to scale it. We scale it by the percentage. Goes from 0% to 100%. So we set up its scale. Entry.opacity is equal to the percentage. So we iterate through every entry in our menu, and we set up the entries values like so. Now we need to do the same thing for the menu, the core system itself. So the title position is equal to initial title position minus new vector2 and we're going to pass it 0, comma our effect, closing parentheses and semicolon. So we just passed the new vector2 0, comma effect. So we're pushing it 100 pixels up to where the title position was. Now we need to set up the title opacity. And that's based off the percentage. So that is the entering. Now let's take a look at the exiting. So the way that the menu system is set up, the menu entry, whenever you enter and exit, you pretty much want to use the same logic. Unless you want to do different effects. Because the way that the percentage works, when you start the exiting process, it's going to start at 100%. Remember, when we are entering, it's going to start at 0%. But when we are exiting, it's 100% at the default position, and then it's going to go down to 0. So we pretty much want to do the same logic if you want the same kind of effect. When we are entering, it's going to fade in, it's going to slide in. When we are exiting, it's going to fade out and slide out. But we are using the same logic because the percent, when we are entering, goes from 0 to 100. When we're exiting, it's going to go from 100 to 0. So it's going to do the opposite effect with the same code. So that is the exiting code logic. Removing. When we are removing the menu entry, let's just go ahead and clear the menu entries list. Alright, now when we want to play or quit. So when we quit, it's just a simple screen system.game.exit. We want to quit the game, so we just call the game.exit, and we get that from the screen system. Now, when we play, we're going to exit this screen, and we call the exit screen method. And then we call the level select.activate. By the way, once this series is done, I will release the list of events and what these screen system does, what kind of properties it has, what events it has, and a quick demonstration on how to use them. Okay, so when we start the game over screen, we pass in the level selection screen. That's going to be deactivated before we call our game over screen. So once we click play again, we are going to reactivate it. If it's deactivated, we're going to reactivate the screen. That's what this method is doing. If the screen is deactivated, it will activate it. If it's already active, it will just do nothing. So we make sure that the level selection screen is activated. It supports input and it is drawing and all that stuff. Now we are exiting this screen because we are done with the Game Over screen. And that pretty much does it for the Game Over screen. So we can build it. Build succeeded. Alright, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of interruptions, so I paused a lot of times. This is the, I split the tutorial into like 8 parts, so I apologize if I got confused in places and just things like that. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial anyway, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now, so this will be the only tutorial I'll get to do. I'll release this to the premium members first, so you'll get this for an entire week before everybody else. And then hopefully next weekend I'll be able to do more tutorials. So next tutorial, remember we're going from the top down, so next tutorial we're going to do the help screen. So hope to see you next time.